Human rights, where do they come from? Just what do we mean when we say we have rights? It seems that everybody likes to exercise the idea that they have certain rights and they are afforded certain privileges that the state shouldn't take away. But how do we get there? What defines a right, and who is the entity that provides those for us? Well, hi everybody, I'm Lenny Esposito, and on this Come Let Us Reason, we're going to explore that question. We're going to find out where rights come from, what they are, and how we define specific types of rights. Are there different kinds maybe that we have to be sensitive to? Senator Tim Kaine made much splash in the different social media venues while he was testifying before the Senate, and he complained that rights don't come from God. In fact, he was appalled that such a suggestion would be made. It's an intriguing question and one that is broader than you may realize. And that's all coming up on this Come Let Us Reason Together. Well, good day again, everyone. I'm glad that you're with me. And in order to tackle this topic of rights, which I think is an important one, and I'm kind of glad it came into the news media this last week, because I'm seeing over and over again a lot of people really kind of confused about rights. We use the word, like I said, a lot, and it doesn't seem that people have a really fundamental grasp on what we mean when we say rights, or they're using the term so loosely that it could just mean anything. Now, I'm not going to do this alone, so I decided to bring in an expert. Dr. Darren Guerra is a constitutional law expert and a gentleman who teaches at Biola University, and a good friend of mine and a colleague that we've worked together in the past. So Darren, first of all, how are you? Nice to see you again.
Doing well. Start of the semester, things are wild and crazy, but it's fun. Wouldn't have it any other way. Thanks for having me.
That's right. And now you've done a lot of work in political theory. Matter of fact, you wrote a book on Article 9 of the Constitution. Five of the Constitution. Yeah. Sorry, I knew there were only 7 articles, so I went, wait, that's not right. Article 5 of the Constitution. So you've studied constitutional law, and you kind of understand it a little bit. When we look at this, first of all, let's step back, and maybe some people who haven't been as active online haven't heard the statement that Senator Tim Kaine made. So what I want to do is I want to first play this for them, and then we can kind of talk about it a little bit and see what the reaction is.
Mr. Barnes, I was struck by your opening comments, and I asked to get a copy of them so I could read them and make sure I quoted them correctly. You state, and this is a quote from Secretary Rubio, "Our rights come from God, our Creator, not from our laws, not from our governments." I find that very, very troubling. I'm a devout person. I was a missionary in Honduras. We've got other devout folks in this room, Christian, Jewish, Muslim American. The notion that rights don't come from laws and don't come from the government, but come from the Creator, that's what the Iranian government believes. It's a theocratic regime that bases its rule on Shia law and targets Sunnis, Baha'is, Jews, Christians, and other religious minorities. And they do it because they believe that they understand what natural rights are from their Creator. So the statement that our rights do not come from our laws or our governments is extremely troubling. I think the motto over the Supreme Court is equal justice under law. The oath that you and I take, pledge to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, not arbitrarily defined natural rights. I'm a strong believer in natural rights, but I have a feeling if we were to have a debate about natural rights in the room and put people around the table with different religious traditions, there would be some significant differences in the definitions of those natural rights.
So, what do you make of this, where he says that he's troubled by Secretary Rubio's statement that our rights come from God, our Creator, not our laws? First of all, this is a standing senator from Virginia, and I'm just, first of all, amazed that he doesn't have the perception to understand what the Declaration of Independence actually claims. So, what was your first response when you heard this?
Yeah, I saw when it was yesterday, the day before when I first started seeing these clips. I was like, my goodness! And I was familiar with Kaine a little bit. Like this is astoundingly obtuse. Like just not understanding these basic principles. Now, it's one thing to like reject them. There's been plenty of scholars and people who said the Declaration is time bound or not relevant anymore. That was very fashionable. Maybe a century ago, there was people making those claims, but to like, it just seems not understanding the basic history of our country, the basic beliefs of the people who founded our country, the overwhelmingly basic beliefs of the American people over these 2 centuries. Like this was very much out of step. And then for him to go on and say, well, Iran also believes that their rights come from God. Um, yeah, he's kind of he's missing a lot of context here, and I think Ted Cruz. I've seen some clips where Ted Cruz responds almost kind of the same way you and I have. Like, I can't believe I'm hearing this from a U.S. senator who went to Harvard Law School. Like, this is basic governance 101, especially American government 101. I know in my American government class, we read the Declaration, we talk about the Declaration, we read Lincoln saying that the Constitution is in service of the principles of the Declaration. Like this is all one package deal. The first organic law of the United States is the Declaration of Independence. And here's Tim Kaine, and it's fine for him to disagree with that view, but he seems to not be aware that that's a pretty mainstream, overwhelming view of the American people, and that his view that what matters is whatever human beings have created for themselves in terms of positive law. That's the only thing that matters. Has been and thankfully I think still is the minority report in America. But yeah, well, that was my initial reaction. There's more that can be said, but
Well, let's talk about this a little bit. So, we have two founding documents, and a lot of times people blur this because Kaine referenced the Constitution. And a lot of folks will even talk about the idea, well, the Declaration of Independence may mention the Creator, but the Constitution doesn't. So we are a secular government, we are a godless government, and that's how we should be governing our people. And I think this is one of the primary misunderstandings that I see a lot of times. I would say that the documents both are significant into the formation of the country, but they're doing different jobs. The Declaration is the why document. This is why we're forming a country. These are the principles and desires that we have. And then the Constitution is the how. These are the mechanics that we will use in order to reach the why. So the mechanics are important. They tell you how a car runs. If the idea of making an automobile is to make a race car, you need the right kind of mechanics so that the car performs at race car capacities. But if you don't know whether you're making a race car, an economy car, or a old jalopy, you're going to be tough pressed as to know how the mechanics should be applied and what mechanics you need to apply. And for me, the Declaration is the why. It sets the standard that the Constitution then has to come up and meet in order to allow them to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's kind of how I see it. But I think a lot of people get that confused.
well, they do, and I think the way you phrase it is great. And I do a similar thing in my courses. Every semester, I teach this in American government, and Lincoln has this great quote. I show them. We draw it on the board, and he says the assertion of that principle. And when he says that principle, he's talking about the Declaration of Independence. So the assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which he's quoting Proverbs there, which has proved to be an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver subsequently framed around it. What's it framed around? The Declaration. The picture, the Constitution and the Union, was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. Now, reading it, there's a lot of moving parts there, so I draw it on the board with my students, but it's pretty clear. You have the apple of gold, that's the declaration. And then you have a picture of silver framing the apple. And the picture on one side of the frame is the Union, another side is the Constitution. And what's Lincoln saying? You don't frame things to hide them. You don't frame things to conceal them. We frame pictures of our family, we frame paintings that we love, and we have these elaborate, beautiful frames. Why? To draw attention to them, to adorn them, to protect them, right? And so in Lincoln's analogy, the Constitution and the Union, our Union as a country, they're there to protect and to adorn, to draw attention to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And so that aligns perfectly with what you were saying, Lenny, about there's the ways and the means. And what are we trying to do? The Constitution is the way that we're going to protect the Constitution. It's the way we're going to apply the principles of the Constitution. I mean, the principle of the Declaration. But it is there, Lincoln would argue. So if you don't agree, and there are people that don't agree. I've had scholars say, no, Lincoln's wrong on that. Well, take it up with him. But if you don't agree with Lincoln, but he is arguing clearly that the Declaration of Independence are the core principles of this country and our founding, and the Constitution is there to frame it. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, another interesting way to look at this is the Constitution within itself provides a means for its own modification. Mm-hmm. So they recognize that the Constitution may need to be changed. The Declaration does no such thing. It makes emphatic statements that says when in the course of human events, so they're starting off with all history, right? It becomes that one people should separate themselves from another. So they're talking about bigger motivations, and that's why we get things like we are endowed with our Creator. Now let's talk a little bit more about the language that Jefferson uses here, as opposed to Kaine. Why do rights need to be grounded in God? I mean, look at all the gods that there are out there. He talks about what about the Baha'i and the Muslims and how they interpret things, and why should we be so haughty or so arrogant as to think that our God and our interpretation is correct?
Yeah, well, this gets into I think part of what Kaine, I don't have the full context of what he's saying, but he does say, well, the Iranian regime believes their rights come from God, right? And we know he's not endorsing the Iranian regime, so he's saying we don't want to be like the Iranians. And then the Ted Cruz clip, which we didn't necessarily see, he kind of says, there's a good reason we're not like the Iranians, but there's a couple things I'd point out is that.
Tell you what, why don't we play the Ted Cruz portion of this, and we can do that there. So hold on one second, and I'll pull that right up.
Mr. Barnes, I'd actually like to go back to the exchange you had with Senator Kaine, and I wish Senator Kaine was still here. Senator Kaine and I were elected together 13 years ago. He is a friend. I would actually encourage observers to go back and listen to what Senator Kaine said, because I have to say I think was disturbing and showed much of where today's Democrat Party has gone wrong. So Senator Kaine said in this hearing that he found it a radical and dangerous notion that you would say our rights came from God and not from government. I just walked into the hearing as he was saying that, and I almost fell out of my chair. Because that radical and dangerous notion, in his words, is literally the founding principle upon which the United States of America was created. And if you do not believe me, and you made reference to this, Mr. Barnes, then you can believe perhaps the most prominent Virginian to ever serve, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator. Not by government, not by the Democratic National Committee, but by God, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I have to say, it is stunning to me that the principle that God has given us natural rights is now deemed by Democrats some radical and dangerous notion. Mr. Jefferson was right when he wrote those words. Government exists to protect those rights. But slavery was not okay when U.S. law allowed it. It was wrong then, it is wrong now, it is always wrong.
Okay, so there's Senator Cruz kind of giving him both barrels, if you will.
Yeah, right.
And I think he brings up a couple of important points. But how did you react to the response?
Yeah, I mean, Cruz is right. These rights, clearly by the text of what Jefferson's arguing, are rooted in truths that are self-evident. So that all men are created as a reference to creatures who have a creator. And he says they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And he lists them: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So they're self-evident, evidenced by human reason. They're endowed by their creator. So who we are as humans, we are rational beings that can perceive self-evident truths such as that. And we have unalienable rights by nature of us being human and rational creatures. With the Creator, those rights cannot be taken from us. We cannot be alienated from them. And just in that simple historic phrase, there's a lot going on there. And,
Yeah.
and it's all the essentials that we need. And there's a lot of directions we could go, but I want to make this point. I would say that ultimately what separates the U.S. and Iran in terms of referencing a created being, a creator, ultimately this is rooted in the character of God, right?
Well,
God's
that's
character. Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
that's definitely true. It's also true, though, that Iran isn't. The Iranian regime doesn't rely upon a claim of rights in its
No.
law. The Ayatollah, matter of fact, the Ayatollah's commands can supersede any rights of any individual, and so his parallel is actually off. But there may be distinctions and differences within. There may be distinctions and differences within our understanding of what those rights are, but that doesn't mean that those rights don't exist. And this is really fundamental to our program. As a matter of fact, it's what Ted Cruz pointed to. He said, even though we held these truths to be self-evident, we violated them in slavery. Now, we didn't think that having slaves, or at least some people, there's arguments that are
Always a
going on
minor
about
debate. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's quite a debate that some people had to allow slavery because otherwise the American experiment would have never gotten off the ground. But it didn't make slavery right until the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment was passed. That, it wasn't that you now no longer have a right to have a slave, but before you did. That kind of nonsense because the law changed, therefore rights changed. No, he's saying the reason why the law changed is because the rights were already there. And just because we get the understanding of rights wrong doesn't mean that the rights themselves don't exist.
Yes, exactly. They are self-evident. They can be discerned by reason. They exist because our Creator has revealed those things to us. He's endowed us in our very nature with those things. And again, that goes to God's character. And so to emphasize, the reason that Ayatollah doesn't have to respect the rights of his citizens is because Allah doesn't have to respect the rights
Right. That's
of his
right.
citizens. Allah is not Yahweh. Allah is not the Christian God. And so you may point to as a logical necessity, there's some point above men who orders the universe, but the character of God matters in that. And Allah's character is radically different than God's character. And God does allow free will. God does respect the individual nature of human beings as his created in his image. His character is unassailable. He is a good God, and that makes all the difference in the world. And what Tim Kaine doesn't realize is, like, he thinks, well, we'll solve the Iranian problem by saying, well, we just create the rights, right? Well, that opens up a whole nother problem, because now you're really relying on the character of fallen human beings.
That's right.
To create, enforce, give rights. I'm sorry, Tim Kaine, you may be a nice guy. I don't really know you, but I don't want you to be the source of my rights. I frankly don't trust you.
So let's look at another point in history, right? If we look at the Nuremberg trials,
Yeah.
continuously and repeatedly, the defense of the SS, the defense of the concentration camp officers, security guards, and commandants was, we were doing what the law allowed and what we were required to do as being in the service of our country. As a military officer, we have to follow orders. This was legal, therefore we are not culpable for it, right? They were claiming that we had to do this because this is what the law stipulated. We were following the law. And if rights come from law, and law says this is what you should do, then we should be able to be absolved of any guilt or any responsibility. And of course, famously, over and over again, the Nuremberg Commission said, no, there is a law above man's law. There is a law that supersedes it. If you take Kaine's position and say rights cannot come from God, they have to come from man, then what you're saying is the Nuremberg trial got it wrong, and the Nazis shouldn't have been prosecuted for their crimes. That's what you're saying.
It does. It leaves Kaine and people like him open to the charge of moral relativism. If law is rooted in the society that creates it only, then law is only subject to law. Law is different in every society, because every society is different. Then you get into trouble of, well, how do you distinguish between societies, right? I have my students read in the first week of American government. We read a little snippet from Plato's Republic, and they're debating what is justice. And you have a sophist, Thrasymachus, saying justice is the will of the strong. It's that in democracies, it's that in aristocracies, and it's that in tyrannies. And we talk with the students like, so yeah, what does this mean? Well, it means that justice is relative. It's relative to the place and the city. It's relative to the type of regime, whether it's a democracy or a monarchy. And then Socrates, in response to Thrasymachus, says, well, I'm not convinced of that. In his Socratic way, it takes him the whole book of the Republic to get to the answer. But he basically says, no, there is a metaphysical reality, that there's a moral order in the universe that law flows from, and it has to conform with the order in the soul. And I read that to these Christian students, and we talk about it, because even the ancients, Romans 1 says God's divine nature and eternal qualities, or his eternal qualities and divine nature, are known from the beginning of creation. So Socrates knew that, Plato knew that, but they don't have the full revelation, right? But they know from nature that there has to be logically a point of departure for law and justice. Otherwise, it's all relative, and it's basically based on human power. And in the West, in Nuremberg, you had the Nazis making the case that we don't have to respect any higher law. Our German laws said that we didn't have to respect these things, and we're just following the law. That's a problem, right? In the American context, Oliver Wendell Holmes, legal positivism was a very popular movement in academic circles, for sure, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He said, this is a quote from an esteemed American jurist, truth is the majority vote of the nation that can lick all others. What is he saying? Truth is dependent upon the majority vote. So he's a democratic, right? Democracy.
Yeah.
but democracy of the most powerful country, that's what determines truth. Well, come on, Oliver. Um, that is relativizing the law. It's making the law relative to the culture, and it's ultimately what Thrasymachus did in 300 BC, what the Nazis did in the 1940s, and what Oliver Wendell Holmes did a couple of decades before then was laws can be dependent on the culture and on power. Power is the only thing that matters.
Right.
And the Iranians, basically, they're more in line with that. They're like, yeah, law is based on power, the power of Allah. But the American tradition, the Anglo-American Protestant Christian tradition was no. Law is rooted in the character of God.
So there's actually more than just these two options. As a matter of fact, when Ted Cruz posted this little bit of an exchange on his social media channels, he got pushback from a gentleman by the name of Rock Chartrand. And here's what Chartrand said. Here's his attempt to kind of split the horns of this dilemma. He says, rights don't come from government, but they don't come from God either. The moment a politician says they do, it means the state gets to play God's interpreter, picking which deity and which commandments to enforce. Well, that makes your rights nothing more than permissions dressed up as scripture. Rights don't come from rulers or religion. They come from your nature as a rational, sovereign individual. They exist because you own your life, not because someone higher up grants them who claims your life as their property. So here we go. He's making a claim that because you own your life, because you are a rational, sovereign individual, that is enough to give you certain basic rights. How does this, first of all, does this argument work? Is he correct in saying we don't need to put God in the equation? We're just rational, sovereign individuals, and that's all that it takes.
No, he makes the same mistake that Thrasymachus did, that Oliver Wendell Holmes did, and essentially the same mistake that the Nazis did, is that the rights, he's just rooting them in some vague humanism, some vague individual humanism, but he's basically saying, look, I determine my rights. Lenny determines his rights, right? But what if Lenny and I have a different version of rights? What if Lenny thinks that his rights allow him to take over my home or end my life? I'm like, well, I don't agree with you, Lenny. I want to keep my home. I want to keep my life, right? Well, how is he going to solve that dilemma? Well, let's take a vote on it. So Lenny goes and gets people, and they outvote me, and then they take my home and they take my life. And that's basically what is done in communist countries. We just get a lot of people to take over the power, and they impose their will on others. So he's kind of sidestepping the problem of who gets to decide and on what basis. And is it simply a matter of you have more autonomous wills imposing their decisions on weaker autonomous wills? It's still the power. It's the power of the strong dominating the weak. He has no operating principle to limit the power of. If he doesn't want to call it the state, he doesn't have any operating principle limiting the power of him and his friends. He doesn't have an operating principle limiting his own power, his own desires. How does he distinguish between, he has two desires, desire to eat 6 In-N-Out cheeseburgers or 1. Which desire is better? He has no rational way to make that basis. Now he'll construct one, and he might say health or this or that, but he's just deferring the decision making, which one is actually true and good and beautiful, and why. Well, it's good and true and beautiful, whatever decision is made, because it conforms to the nature of the universe. And that nature of that universe was created by a good and loving God. If you can't trace it back to a good and loving God, not just a powerful God, a good and loving God, then you don't have much. It has to be a certain God with a certain character that sets this thing in motion. And this gentleman, I forget his name, he's cutting it off at the heels, and he's sidestepping a lot of those questions.
Well, and he's missing another move that is generally made in these kinds of contexts. First of all, you have to say, well, wait a minute, why do rights attach to rational, sovereign individuals? What? Because if it's I always talk about this with friends who are materialists or evolutionists. and they say we just happen to be the lucky ones that had a bigger brain, and humanity isn't necessarily the best species on the planet, right? We gotta give room to the other species. They say, well, maybe you're right. Maybe we should just blow ourselves up and let the cockroaches have it next. Why should you privilege humanity? He seems to be privileging humanity. But the second move is to simply dehumanize those to whom you wish not to have rights. So you brought up, for example, Oliver Wendell Holmes. One of his most famous decisions, 1924, Buck versus Bell, where, infamous, where Virginia sued so that Carrie Buck, I believe was her name, was the institution she was clinically understood as feeble-minded. Her mother was an alcoholic. She may or may not have been feeble-minded. She definitely had a hard life, but they wanted to forcibly sterilize her. Now, at this point, eugenics was all the rage, and the two main countries across the globe that really leaned into eugenics was Nazi Germany and the United States. And in 1924, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in his decision that the state has an obligation to forcibly sterilize Carrie Buck because she could be bringing in another generation of an individual who the state then has to care for. And he says 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, is his famous quote. And of course, the Nazis then turned around and did this with the Jewish people. They're not human. The slave traders did this with the slaves. They're a different species. They're not human. So one of the problems that Chartrand just smacks up against is the fact that it's easy to dismiss the humanity. And human beings do this. You're worried about which deity that we're going to follow. Well, look, God as creator, and again, specifically the loving Christian God that you mentioned, has specifically said that all men, right, have inestimable worth. All men bear the image of God, be it slave or free, be it Greek or Jew, be it rich or poor, male or female, all of them bear God's image. And really, it is only Christianity that starts talking about individual rights. This concept of individual rights doesn't even exist in the world in any real meaningful way until St. Paul and then Augustine kind of reinforce it. So I think one of the problems with Chartrand's argument is he really kind of doesn't estimate well how easy it is for human beings to be dismissed as less than human, as subhuman, and therefore rights don't attach to them.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I've read a number of accounts that basically say, well, we don't need the Christian God, and we don't need kind of a theological grounding for these things. We can just have humanism, a human grounding, and that seems to be what he's asserting. Another gentleman I have my students read, who's a good thinker, but I don't agree with him, is Steven Pinker of Harvard, and he basically says, look, the Enlightenment gave us the Declaration, so at least Pinker would improve on Kaine. He actually knows that these rights need to be grounded in something. He just thinks they can be grounded in the Enlightenment and human thought and human dignity and so forth. That he likes the products of the West. But then Tom Holland, another atheist, they're both atheists. Tom Holland writes a book, Dominion. Now Holland's a historian. He writes his magistral work on the history basically of Christianity, because he started realizing as a Western liberal, he really liked the protections of human rights. He liked human dignity. He liked the rule of law. And the more he was an ancient historian, the more he studied ancient Rome and ancient Greece, he's like, I don't really see these things in these ancient cultures. And
in fact, he was scared. He goes, man, I don't want to be a Roman. The more he got familiar with their history, he goes, oh my gosh, they're barbaric. I would have never survived it.
Yeah, exactly. And so he starts realizing as this Western liberal atheist, he's like, oh. And so he writes this history. He's like, basically, all of the rights that we enjoy now come historically from the growth and development of Christianity. And he says in his last chapter, he's saying, look, this reliance on humanism as a philosophy, he's like, humanism as a philosophy has no ground. Nazis take the humanism and turn it into these dark areas, and Western liberals take humanism and they try to turn it into these light areas. But humanism itself has no content. It's contentless. You can fill it with whatever you want. And I like to tell my students, right, humanists or Western liberals like Steven Pinker, they love the products of Western culture. They love the human rights. They love limited government. They love institutions. They love liberalism. So they love, an analogy I would say, they love apples. But they don't like the tree that produces the apples, and that tree is Western civilization. And they even less like the soil that produced Western civilization, that produced the apple tree. They don't like Christianity. But without Christianity, without the soil growing the tree, and without the tree growing the apples, i.e. the institutions and the rights, and like, you need the whole package. You can't love apples and hate apple trees.
So let's take this to the next, because the next point, as you say, Western liberals, you can fill humanity with anything, and what we've seen is that's actually happening. It's happening specifically in the UK today, where people, in the name of not hurting feelings, in the name of not disparaging others, and now you have the British government actually suppressing speech, actually jailing individuals, all for a supposed moral high ground. So most recently, of course, headlines were made as the comedy writer, who was it? Graham Linham, and I guess he's really popular in the UK, wrote several really well-known shows, had 5 officers surround him in London Heathrow, put him in handcuffs and take him off to jail. Why? Because he wrote an X post that said, if a trans-identified male is in a female-only space, he's committing a violent, abusive act. And he says, make a scene, call the cops, and if all else fails, punch him in the genitals. Now, they felt that was crossing over the line. Again, the UK doesn't have a First Amendment. Right? Canada doesn't have a First Amendment. So what they do is they take, in the name of being rational individuals, in the name of being autonomous, saying that your autonomy can actually extend to what sex you want to identify as. Your autonomy can actually extend to what sports team you want to play on. And therefore, you can't even say anything disparaging against them, because that now becomes a crime against this person's rights. And I think this is kind of what you're saying, right? I'm deeply concerned about what I'm seeing in the UK, and it humbles me to think that our founders were thoughtful enough. Matter of fact, it wasn't even actually our founders. The people wouldn't accept the Constitution until those Bill of Rights were included. The people knew what tyranny looked like, and they said, we want some guarantees beforehand. And thank God they did, because freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, those are fundamental. And I would have never thought that they needed to be instated so much as I am seeing today with supposedly other liberal Western democracies.
Yeah, no, it's shocking what happened and what is happening in England, and it does go to the point that democracy is not a guarantee of rights. Western liberalism of this progressive sort is not a guarantee of rights, because what you need a principle that distinguishes between my autonomy and your autonomy, right? And what's happening, at least what happened in England, is the people in control of the government, more of them decided to prosecute Graham for his speech than are going to defend him. We'll see how it plays out in the long term. But there's no guarantee in the positive law that protects him from a majority just trampling his rights, because ostensibly they don't believe rights are rooted in something beyond the majority of the will of the majority, and that's what the First Amendment codifies, is the principle that certain rights are not subject to majority will. Certain rights attached to persons for them being a person created in the image of God. Now, any government, even the American government, right? If you had a supermajority someday say repeal the First Amendment, it could be repealed in principle. It could. That would be a grave mistake. But thankfully, I think in the near future, you could not get a supermajority to throw off the First Amendment. And so it's a positive law protection for a natural law principle, right? And so
Right.
the positive, again, back to our theme, the positive law, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, should be serving the natural law principles in the Declaration. And what England does not have that arrangement, right? It's just simply they've moved from a constitution of customary constraint and the symbols of laws and customs from the Magna Carta and the English Declaration of Rights into basically parliamentary sovereignty. And
Yeah.
whatever the majority wants, the majority gets. And the Americans really debated this because England had been moving in that direction for a while, and the Americans saw it, and they said, no, we want to claim the rights of the British Constitution rooted in ancient rights of man, the Magna Carta, all these things. And you had more modern thinkers in England saying, no, Parliament's now the sovereign. Parliament's in control, and you don't have access to these customary rights. And that's when the Americans are saying, well, then we're getting off this ship, And those kinds of arguments really led to the American Revolution.
Yeah, and you in your statement you made a distinction between different kinds of rights, certain rights. You said not necessarily all rights, and I think that we probably also for our listeners need to tease this out a little bit because there are different kinds of rights. There are different things that we mean when we say rights. For example, and this gained a lot of headlines when it was passed, but in 2021, the United Nations voted whether food is a human right. Right, so they were passing a resolution that food should be considered a human right. Now, the only country that voted no on that was the United States. Israel abstained, if I understand. But why would this be not a right? I mean, it's fundamental, right? Food, water, shelter, these are fundamental to our survival. They're fundamental to life. So what makes food not a right where, say, free speech is a protected right? And how do those two things work within our framework?
Well, and that's where we do get into positive rights versus negative rights. And just logically speaking, food is not a right. I mean, just in terms of metaphysics, food is just not a thing. In the same way a right is. Access to food depends on someone else's labor. So when you say food is a right, what you're saying is I have a right to someone else's labor to provide me that food that I want, which is one step removed, not that far as it is, to I can enslave if necessary. I can superintend someone else's time and money and labor to provide me the food that I claim as a right. So, I mean, it's fundamental in the sense that you can't claim a right over someone else. You can't claim a right over their time. You can't claim a right over their money and their energy. And so what positive rights in this way run into is, well, I can't make Lenny give me his time and money and food. But if enough of us get together, we can have the government make Lenny give me his food and time and energy. And so pretty soon Lenny's liberty is then now subject to the power, again, of the majority or the few, whoever's running the government. That trumps these positive rights, trump the liberty of other citizens who are co-opted or enslaved to provide other people those rights.
So basically what you're saying is the natural rights, the fundamental rights, these self-evident rights are things that exist within us already. The ability to choose our religion, the ability to speak freely, And even if that freedom means spreading that information so that other people can be better informed, not having my home invaded by a military operation under force or threat so that they get to sleep in my house, without my approval. The right to protect myself, the right to bear arms, the right to not incriminate myself. All of these types of things are things that exist within me. And what the government is trying to do is force me to be something other than who I would be. Whereas those are the kind of the negative rights that you're talking about. In order to remove the right, you have to do something to the individual negatively. But these other rights, positive rights, require additional input for them to be executed. So the debate is and has been and will be on healthcare. Isn't healthcare a right? Well, the access for an individual to find healthcare is a right, but it's not a right that access should be provided free of charge. Any more than shelter, which is also a basic human necessity, should be afforded free of charge. I don't know many people who think that everybody should be getting a free home, because who's going to pay the builders? Who's going to buy the land? Who's going right? There are actual costs and labor and value associated with a home that are necessary to exchange before that shelter obtains. And I think that's the difference. These rights are within us. They're trying to change us from the fundamental individual and beliefs we hold versus the rights that allow us to live more freely or fully or better than we may otherwise live, simply because either A, we're in a bad situation, or B, we just don't want to do the work, things like that.
Yeah, no, and a good word you said there, I think, in terms of is access, right? Like, no one's against food, but if I was preventing people from accessing food that's there available, that would be a problem. If no one's if I'm opposing people accessing healthcare, that's a problem. But again, with the healthcare, do you have a right to someone else's labor? Do you have a right to commandeer a doctor against their will? Do you have a right to force people to go to medical school who don't want to go to medical school? Like, those are the questions when people just throw this stuff out, like foods are right, healthcare's are right. It sounds nice, but then they start thinking on the back end, like, well, who's going to provide the food? Who's going to provide the healthcare? Well, I'm not going to do it, so I'm going to go force someone else to do it on my behest. Well, that's what we used to call slavery, right?
That's right.
Enslave someone to provide you food. Lincoln said that when I eat after the labor of someone else, that's slavery, right? When when the state forces doctors to provide services of their time against their choosing, if that goes so far, that's slavery. When you're taking someone else's labor without paying them or compensating them. So people just don't think these things through. They just throw around these rights to this and rights to that. Well, who's going to provide it, right? And that's the problem with positive life. Now, does that mean government can't force people to do certain things? I mean, we had a draft, right? We have done that. But there are certain times where the community does make demands on the individuals, and you can't simply just have individuals doing whatever they want. But in the U.S., and given our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, the arguments for commandeering people to defend the nation, right, in a draft, or any restrictions the government puts on individuals should be carefully vetted and carefully weighed against their claims of their rights. You can't just run roughshod over people in our system. But I don't know. I'd be curious to, Tim Kaine, apparently, if the rights come from the government can change them tomorrow, right? If you get enough votes, you can just do whatever you want.
That's right. But so what if somebody is at this point saying, well, wait a minute, what about another right that we hear about all the time that is within myself and within my choices? What about the right to abortion? because there I am affecting me, and it's my life, and it's my body. And right, this is the rhetoric we hear don't I have that as a fundamental right? Doesn't this meet your criteria of something that's inherent inside of me that you're stopping me from exercising?
And that's why people who've thought carefully about abortion get really quickly into the idea of personhood. Is what's inside of me a human person from the point of conception, or is it merely a clump of cells? And the answer to that question really determines the outcome, right? If it really is just a clump of cells, right, then what's
Yeah, there's no pro-tumor rights, there's no pro-tumor movement. You know, tumors are removed, and nobody is saying no, you should keep it because it's a living thing.
Yes, exactly, right. Lincoln did a similar thing in the age of slavery. He's saying, look, there's a difference between a slave and a hog, right? A slave, he's trying to make the point, like, whatever status you want to put slaves in, they're human beings. Everybody knows they are. It's the same thing. Well, the claim that the pro-choice, they want to say, well, it's a potential life, or it's a life. But when people push into that, like, when does it become a life? And like, they can't draw the line. Why? Because ontologically, it is a human being from the point of conception. Everybody really knows that. And people are lying to themselves when they try to draw the line later, and they're drawing the line later because it benefits them in some way. They don't want the responsibility, perhaps, or whatever. There's a lot of different reasons. But the debate really is, what is it? Are these just a clump of cells, or is it a human being? If it's a human person, then all the rights that attach to you also attach to it.
Right.
And it is, and at that point, it's somewhat complicated medically and biologically, but in terms of rights, it's once you identify a person, they have all the rights that attend to another human person.
Your rights stop when you have a point where it basically ends the life of another human being. And I always use the term human being. I think that's more clear. Yeah. Person can be a wiggle word sometimes, but it goes back to the thing I talked about before, right? If rights are simply legal, then you just define that as a non-person. Now, our law today is really bifurcated. It's almost a Jekyll and Hyde, because while you can, many states say, matter of fact, even California, you can, with impunity, get an abortion at any point in time. But if you are in an accident with a woman who's pregnant and you cause her to miscarry, you could be put up on murder charges. Or if you stab a woman in the stomach, you can be put up on homicide charges. So the law hasn't caught up to this yet, but you can see how it's really kind of schizophrenic in its approach as well. So I think this is really interesting, and we've covered a lot. But here's a teaser that I want to talk about in terms of rights and why this is so important theologically. Because again, I think rights are based in the idea that we are created in the image of God. We are rational animals. We have the ability to think. We have the ability to understand who God is. So we are morally aware. We are intellectually aware. We can project into the future. Project by, I mean, we can make assumptions and say, hey, there will be consequences if we do path A, there will be consequences if we do path B. We may not see all of the consequences, but we can make those distinctions. Animals don't do that. They don't rationalize what their future would be. They don't think about things empathetically. A dog never says, I wonder what it would be like to be a cat. Right? They don't think like that. Animals don't. They're just present with whatever stimulus that they're giving, and they're so human beings have this idea, this rationality, and this freedom then to exercise that rationality. The idea of freedom of speech is you can say bad things. Maybe Graham Linehan was saying things that were distasteful. Maybe he shouldn't have made that statement. That doesn't make it jailable, even though it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. So being legally right and being morally right are two different things. You don't, just because it's legal doesn't make it moral, right? It's legal to have an affair. It's legal to do adultery, but that doesn't mean that it's moral. Or just because, marijuana has been legalized doesn't mean that it's a good thing that you smoke it. That doesn't follow. But God allows those kinds of things because we are humans and we have free will, we have choice, and that's part of what makes us human. Now, I bring this up because one of the questions that people struggle with within Christendom, or struggle with regarding Christianity, is the problem of violating rights, sinning, and then being punished for those sins, right? And some people will say one of the things that doesn't make Christianity appropriate is the inhumanity that God shows in sentencing individuals to an eternal punishment for their sins. And they will say, maybe God, if he is truly the moral judge, can judge people on account of their sins. Maybe their sin, if they're 80 years old, maybe they have to pay for 80 years of sins. Maybe they did some heinous thing, took 3 lives, and they got to pay for 3 lifetimes worth of sins. How can you justify a God who would allow people to be punished for eternity for their sins? Because it seems like there's no way I can sin so much that I should hold eternal punishment, right? That's the objection. But here's my response. God, I think, in understanding human rights and in endowing us with those rights, he says these are part of the things that make us human beings. Rights make us human beings. And therefore, God won't take those things away from us. God won't make us robots. I think God wouldn't be a loving God if he turned us all into Stepford wives. We'd never sin. But as Stepford wives, we're not actually showing true volition. We're not showing love to him. That's just a robot running a program. And we would be something less than human if God took our will away and replaced it with something else. And I think this is also true post-death, because Christianity teaches that people have eternal souls that will live forever. And therefore, Christians who make a commitment to Jesus Christ, whose lives are changed and transformed, they still retain this free will. Now, we don't sin in heaven because I think one of the things that happens is we start to see sin for what it really is. And as the Holy Spirit reveals that to us, as he lives inside of us, it becomes more and more distasteful. And then on the other side of death, it becomes so distasteful that we would never even think about doing it. So I don't think that God says you cannot do it in the sense of it's impossible. It's just impossible in the way that, what's the Bible passage? As a dog returns to his own vomit, right? People don't do that. Not because they physically can't, but because it's so absurd that nobody would think about doing it in their own mind, right? So it would be like that to sin for a Christian. But for a non-believer who's mad at God, who doesn't bow the knee willingly, who curses God and dies, that freedom to curse God still exists. And because that freedom to curse God still exists, he can continue to do so post-death. He can continue to be alienated from God and actually even blame God after, right, Revelation 20 and 21, where the sea and the outer dark, they all give up their dead, and Hades and Sheol give up their dead, and they get tossed into the outer darkness where they exist in torment forever and ever. Well, that torment continues to exist for 2 reasons. First of all, God isn't there, and whatever is good and pleasant, right, comes down from the Father of lights. And every good and precious gift is what God gives, and so there's none of that left. So they just don't exist in that. But they also, I think, have this problem in the fact that they continue to curse God. They continue to sin post-death. And if they continue to sin, then it would make sense that their punishment would continue to accrue post-death. So one of the interesting dovetails with the question of rights and the idea of worth is that rights are based on the worth of the individual, the imago Dei that all of us have. And if you start saying rights don't follow from the Creator, then you start to question the ultimate worth of the individual. And on the backside, one of the ways we understand the worth of the individual and his relationship to God is through the fact that when you violate that relationship, you will suffer the consequences of it. So that's just a kind of a side note that this makes me think of. What else do we need to think about when we have this discussion on rights? Because everybody seems to, like I said, assert their rights. What would you, if you're telling your students, okay, whenever you get on campus and you talk about somebody who wants to talk about rights, matter of fact, we didn't play the section of Kaine's speech where he talks about how the U.S. is removing LGBTQ rights from its documentation. He makes that claim in the further, a little further along in his statements. You know, everybody claims rights. How do you tell students to approach others who are claiming rights, and what's a good way to get other people to kind of understand this differentiation?
Well, yeah. So rights are not rooted, as I think we've established earlier, or at least asserted. I don't know if people would say we established, but rights are not rooted in our autonomy, a mere assertion of our will against other wills. It's not. We don't. The American project is not just a clashing of wills, although some would assert that, but it's not just an assertion of wills. Rights are naturally bounded by the reality that God created, and like I said, God's character. So rights are not absolute. They have boundaries. Our liberty is not absolute. It has boundaries. That's the difference between liberty and license. Liberty is a freedom exercised within proper bounds. License is the absence of boundaries on liberty. That's just doing whatever you want when you want. Liberty is doing what you ought to do. And then that does kick the can down the road in terms of, well, what ought we to do, right? But liberty is rooted in an oughtness, in boundaries set by the natural order. That's where we talk of natural rights. And that those natural rights and that natural order are also nested in God's creation. God is creator, which is nested in, as you were kind of unpacking in talking about God's character. He allows us free will because that's his character. He doesn't impose himself on us. He wants our love and our obedience, but our obedience freely given, right? And so that again goes to his character. So the whole chain there, from God's character into nature, into the natural law, into liberty and freedom, but it's bounded, it's ordered liberty is the language that a lot of the founders would have used. Ordered liberty, not license. And so a lot of the modern debates today are people asserting that liberty is whatever I say it is. You saw that in the one quote you read. Well, no, liberty is rightly ordered liberty. Liberty is freedom to be who we were created to be. I'm not free because I assert my right to be addicted to heroin. That's not freedom. That's slavery to heroin, right? It's not freedom to use my liberty to engage in behaviors that demean me as a person or demean you as a person. That's not freedom. Liberty is rightly ordered, and so that's just really part of liberty. And I think a lot of the discussions miss the very nature of liberty, rooted in God's character, rooted in a natural order that God created that does put natural boundaries on it. And we have language to describe extending liberty beyond its natural limits, and that's license, right? That's moral anarchy. We have language for that because they're real things. And so people that are asserting, Lincoln said it this way, and this can be applied in a lot of different ways. You do not have a right to do a wrong. If something is fundamentally wrong, you don't have a right to it. You only have a right to those things that are good and true and beautiful, right? And then context certainly matters.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end it. So I appreciate that. Thanks so much, Darren, for all that you do. This has been fun, and I'm glad that they brought it up. Maybe we can hopefully have a little bit more clarity on what we mean when we start talking about rights, the differentiation between positive and negative rights, and why it's absolutely essential that if you claim rights, then you have to understand that those rights come from a God, and now you're beholden to understand who that God is and what rights he actually does bestow. So hope to talk to you again soon. I'm sure we will, but thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Larry.
All right. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.